Hi, everyone. Good evening. We are so happy to welcome many of you this evening for our Dinner with a Doctor series. I know this is a highly anticipated topic of drug development and discussing where we are in celiac disease. We have some really amazing guest panelists tonight that have joined us, and we are so humbled and happy to have them, including members of our own team. But I want to just quickly introduce myself. I'm Rachel Lieberman. I am a director here at the Celiac Disease Center, and I work alongside two awesome colleagues who help me put this together always. Lindsay Yeagle is our educational coordinator. I know a lot of you hear a lot from her, and we are so thankful for her helping us put together these amazing topics and programs. And Dr. Ritu Verma, who is our medical director. She's also our chief of pediatric gastroenterology here at Comer Children's Hospital at University of Chicago. And I like to say my trusty sidekick who helps us keep things going, which is fantastic and always has wonderful ideas. So thank you. And you will hear a lot more from them shortly. But with our panel, I am so excited to welcome Doug Jacobstein, who is currently a senior vice president and head of clinical development at Abivax, working on development of a small molecule for IBD injections, I'm losing my words. I'm not even going to try to say it.
Ulcerative colitis.
Thank you, Dr. Verma, and Crohn's disease. And prior to that, the reason we really are so happy to have Doug, he has so much experience in celiac drug development, including he was recently a vice president and clinical lead at Prevention Bio for the phase 2B proactive study. And that was looking at the anti-IL-15 antibody in celiac disease. So thank you, Doug, for being with us. We also have Dan Leffler, who is, many of you might know, we're so happy to have him. He is a practicing gastroenterologist, and he is a founding member of the Celiac Center at Beth Israel Medical Center, as well as an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. And most relevantly, he is the executive medical director of clinical science here at Takeda Pharmaceuticals. That was a mouthful, but we are so happy to have Dan, and he brings so much experience and insight, and we're so happy to have him. And then we have two of our fellow colleagues from University of Chicago. We have Dr. Carol Semrad, who is an adult gastroenterologist specializing in small bowel disease, including obviously celiac disease and nutrition. And Dr. Semrad is a really wonderful part of our leadership team here at the Celiac Disease Center and is instrumental in drug trials in celiac disease for our adult patient base. And Dr. Valerie Abedy, who is a research associate professor here at U of C. And Dr. Abedy is internationally recognized for her expertise in immunology and celiac disease. And she is a wonderful member of our Celiac Center. And we are just so happy to have everyone here with us. And I think you're going to gain a lot of insights, a lot of different perspectives, and hopefully walk away learning a lot. So before I get started, Dr. Verma, is there anything you would like to add before I get our program going?
No, this is long coming. I know everyone is excited and wants to know more about where are we with a drug. We do have our gluten-free diet, but we do need a drug. So hopefully today everyone will understand the whole process of drug development and where we are with celiac disease. So I think this is going to be exciting. It's great.
I agree. So the way we would love to set out, I want to do a little housekeeping. Tonight is getting recorded, so if for any reason you have to drop off, just know that this will be posted on our YouTube channel, so you can access this content. I also want to note that if you have questions, please utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will be opening up to a panel discussion addressing those questions and also previously submitted questions shortly. But what I would love to do is right now welcome Doug Jacobstein, who can really walk us through drug development, the phases of trials, and give us some basics as we get started with our discussion. So Doug?
So much. Good to see everybody on the call, and thanks for the opportunity to to attend this really important session tonight. So I was asked just to spend a couple minutes talking about the phases of drug development, just to level set the community on the phone about how drug development works and how to think about it when you're asked to participate in trials. So I won't go into preclinical studies, which typically involve animals, but we'll skip right to phase one. Phase one studies are typically done, and this is going to be a general description. I'll try and tie in some celiac as I can, but in general, phase one studies are done for safety and generally done in healthy volunteers. And so a phase one study involves maybe 25 to 30 patients. It can be a little bit more or a little bit less. In general, patients are healthy. They come in and they will start out with single doses of a drug. That dose may increase, so they may take more than one dose level in what's called a single ascending dose trial. And then oftentimes, as you go further into the phase one trial, you'll do multiple ascending doses where they'll actually take multiple days of the same drug and study that. And again, what they're looking for in that phase one study is safety and tolerability of the drug. Occasionally, there are trials that you'll see that are labeled as 1B trials, and those are trials that are often done in patients who may have the disease state, but still looking primarily at safety. So there's a 1A and a 1B component to the phase one area of drug development. If the drug proves to be safe and tolerable to patients, that the drug will then be moved into what's called phase two. And in phase two, there are also two parts. There are 2A studies and phase 2B studies. In a phase 2A study, this is generally the first time that you're testing the drug in a particular disease state. Again, a 2A study in celiac disease, where you take celiac patients, and oftentimes that 2A study is a small study. It's what's called a proof of concept study. So you're looking at efficacy in the disease state, also looking at safety as an important outcome measure. Generally, those phase 2A studies are going to be smaller studies as well, on the order of somewhere between 40 to 150 patients. Generally speaking, also, you may have one or two doses, and it'll be compared to a placebo, again, in that disease state. And in celiac disease, you guys may be familiar, the 2A study often involves a gluten challenge. So they may be a short trial. It could be 6 weeks, it could be 8 weeks, it could be 12 weeks, exposed to gluten and randomized to either receive drug or placebo. If the drug shows some efficacy in that proof of concept study, that drug will then be moved into what's called phase 2B. And in phase 2B, oftentimes it's a dose ranging study where you're testing multiple doses against placebo. If you look at a celiac study in general, in celiac studies, they won't involve a gluten challenge in phase 2B. Instead, they'll look at patients who are on a gluten-free diet but continue to have symptoms, something called non-responsive celiac disease. And so oftentimes in that 2B study, that's what you're looking at. And then if that drug, once the trial reads out, if it's shown to be safe and the drug is shown to be efficacious, the drug will be then taken into phase 3 studies. And phase 3 studies are the studies that are required in order to file a drug application for approval. So you need to demonstrate efficacy, generally speaking, in two large, adequately, what the FDA says is adequate and well-controlled trials. So you'll have a drug arm or two drug arms and a placebo arm, and you'll be studying to see how well the drug does versus the placebo. These trials can be anywhere from 400 to 1,000 patients and on up. Some cardiac studies are even larger than that. But again, what you're looking for is to test for safety and efficacy of the drug against the placebo. And if they're successful, they can lead to registration of the drug. And so those are generally the types of studies that you'll see. Most of the time when we're recruiting for studies, we're looking for patients with active celiac disease, who have biopsy-proven celiac disease, and who are willing to participate in trials. Again, if you don't want to do gluten challenge studies, which I completely understand, then a 2B or a phase 3 study may be a more adequate study to do rather than the 2A study.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you. That was really informative and a great overview. And so what I'd like to do is welcome Dan Leffler on to really bring that conversation into the world of celiac disease and where we are.
Yeah, so thank you. And again, thanks for having me. Hope everyone's well where you are. So so let me just start by saying this is really an incredibly exciting time in celiac drug development, or the search for therapies that can help people beyond the gluten-free diet. And actually, it is beyond the gluten-free diet. I just want to make it clear that everything that is being worked on really is things that are adjunctive to a gluten-free diet. They're not a replacement for a gluten-free diet. That may or may not be where we get to eventually. There may or may not be the desire or the need for that. But we do know that so many people are just not doing as well as they could on a gluten-free diet alone. And we can spend some more time talking about that. But that's really what at least the medications that are being worked on today are being worked on to do, is really to help people who are not fully responding or having an undue amount of burden trying to be adequately gluten-free, helping them have better disease control and better quality of life. So with that, let me tell you why I think this is such an exciting time right now in celiac disease, in the search for celiac disease medications. And to do that, let me step back a second and just give like a really like 10,000-foot view of what we know about how celiac disease works. And that is that gluten gets eaten by people with celiac disease all the time, mostly accidentally, but we know this happens to everyone. But gluten is not digested by human or most mammalian enzymes. So it gets in big pieces. In the intestine, it can cross through the gut barrier. In the gut, it gets acted upon by this enzyme, tissue transglutaminase, which most of you probably know as a TTG. A lot of people out there probably had a blood test for this at some point in the past. And then once gluten is actually acted on by TTG and it sort of changes shape a little bit, it gets much more toxic to the immune system. The immune system acts on it and it sort of goes a little crazy and creates all these inflammatory chemicals and brings blood cells and causes all the symptoms you know. Is that we know all these steps is pretty clear about the major steps of disease. And you have, for each of those steps, right? Pause for a second. Anyway, hopefully my internet. Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know what happened, but
Dan, you're
let me just
cutting off a
repeat
little bit.
quickly.
Thank you. You were cutting off a little bit.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, hopefully that was transient. I don't know why that happened. So as I was saying, we understand how celiac disease works pretty well. The science has advanced and we have medications targeting each major step in celiac disease. So I don't think there is a single medication that's going to be perfect for celiac disease, just like there isn't a single medication that's good for inflammatory bowel disease. I think it's going to take many types of medications for many different people. And what's exciting is that we have so many types of medications targeting so many different steps in the celiac process. The other thing that's exciting is that we have a lot of different types of trials. So as Doug just mentioned, there's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. We have multiple studies that are in phase 2, multiple in phase 1. Nothing today in phase 3, but I'm hopeful that will change. And these trials are also designed differently and involve different types of people with celiac disease. So I think we really, for the first time, might have the critical mass of the number of different medicines and the number of different trials to really make sure we have success in an area where we haven't had so much success, unfortunately, in the past.
Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate your insight. What I want to do is welcome the panel up, and we obviously have some submitted questions, and I really encourage people, please submit questions to the Q&A function as we start off our discussion. But what I would love to do is really the burning question, I think, for so many people is why? Dan, you mentioned optimism and that we're finally at a point and we have a critical mass of a lot of different trials, but why haven't we developed a drug for celiac yet? And I'm going to turn it to Doug first, if you want to take this question, but I would love actually each of our panelists to give their insight and thoughts into that question, because I think everyone comes from a different perspective of research and where we are. So Doug, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So I think to start with, I would say that there's probably not one easy answer for this question. I know it's frustrating to hear, and we'd love to be able to say, oh, it's absolutely because we didn't understand why patients get celiac disease. And as Dan said, I think we have a good understanding of that. So I think the simplest thing is for a long time, it was assumed incorrectly that the gluten-free diet was the be-all end-all treatment for celiac disease. And as you know, there are a lot of autoimmune diseases, but there's only one autoimmune disease where we know the trigger. And so, for the longest time, it was assumed you go on a gluten-free diet, you get better, and that's that. And I think, a combination of things have happened. The recognition, obviously, that patients with celiac disease are suffering, even though they're on a gluten-free diet. They still have symptoms. They still want to be able to do the things, to go out to eat with friends and not have to worry about exposure to gluten in foods. And I think pharmaceutical companies are starting to listen to that. Developing a drug, we didn't really get into this, as I mentioned, the stages and the phases of development, but it can cost anywhere from 800 million to over $1 billion to develop a drug. For any disease state, celiac included. And so it's a big commitment from a pharmaceutical standpoint to look into that. And I think, again, if you take the basis that that pharmaceutical companies have worked under for so long, which is that the gluten-free diet is the be-all end-all, and it's expensive to develop a drug, and there were other areas that they were interested in. I think now there's a groundswell of interest. There are multiple large pharmaceutical companies that are interested in developing a drug for celiac disease. And I think now, there is this push, hopefully to bring therapies to patients with the disease. And so, I don't want to sound, I want to be positive about this and be optimistic that we will have treatments for celiac disease, in the nearer term rather than 20, 30 years from now. So, but I think those are the factors that have gone into the lack of a drug so far.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Carol Semred, would you like to address this question from your perspective and what you've seen in trials here at University of Chicago?
Yes, I think from my point of view, while we know a lot about the mechanisms of celiac disease, we don't know enough basic science, and we need more. So to pretend that we understand everything that's happening from the point someone eats gluten to the point that they develop bowel inflammation, I think we have broad strokes and we're much closer than other people. But first of all, we still need more basic science to understand it. Secondly, there's a variety of clinical presentations for celiac disease. So it's very difficult to get the ideal study without the variables involved, that you actually get a solid answer as to whether that drug is going to be useful or not. And so we've made some, not mistakes, but learned a lot along the way as to how to design these trials to give us an answer, yes or no. And then lastly, it's the sort of output. What are we measuring? And I don't think we talk a lot about this. We don't have the exact output to measure where we can very easily compare results of patients. We have biopsies, we have antibodies, but we're working a lot on trying to get outputs that are going to be more reliable to measure and then compare to each other. So I think there's clinical factors, there's reading output factors, and there's that we still don't know enough about the basic science, and we've tried to target key steps we thought would be important. And so far we haven't been able to show that that's going to be better than the gluten-free diet. And I just have to always please don't demonize the gluten-free diet. People get better. They do extremely well on it. It is everything everyone talked about, but believe me, there are many other diseases that if they had something like the gluten-free diet to make them most recover and not have disease like in inflammatory bowel disease, they would jump on that and be grateful. So I think we have to really understand that the gluten-free diet is a very powerful treatment, but there are some problems with it, and all of what everyone talked about is still existing, and that doesn't mean we don't go on and try to find treatments for, problems with the gluten-free diet. And maybe the holy grail would be to promote immune tolerance, where in the end, your immune system would no longer respond to gluten in the diet. And that would be sort of the ultimate cure, if you wanted to say, for celiac disease, where people could eat it again. So I think, and I don't think we're any different than any other disease. It's steps, and I think the celiac scientists have stepped up and really pushed forward development. And Dan Leffler was one of the key people in this regard. He's been to the government talking to everyone about dollars and money to support celiac research. So we're okay. I say we're on target.
Well, thank you, Carol, for that perspective. I really value that. And Valerie, just from someone who is actually doing a different kind of science, I would love your insight from your perspective.
Yeah, so as a basic scientist, I have to agree with Carol on some point that we still need to better understand. We understand the big picture. We know, I agree with Dan, we know how celiac disease is induced, but I think we don't understand totally, the intricacy of the immune response and all the actors that are the interplay between the actor also in time, because it's a chronic disease. So you have the onset of the disease and you have the chronicity. So we still can get some better knowledge, because we have to take into account that we're going to treat patients, that have been on gluten-free diet. So they've been exposed to gluten, then put on a gluten-free diet for a long time. It's not a simple eat, it's not like an acute disease, it's a chronic disease. So that adds complexity. Then I have to also agree with Dan that we are great. I think we had a good momentum, because actually during the past 3 decades, a lot has been known about celiac disease, and we know better and better the immune response. And I think it's actually the good moment to bridge both basic science and pharmaceutical science, if I could say, and clinical work, and it's actually very important, I think, now on to when one wants to implement a therapy, to get knowledge at the same time and to go back to basic science to understand why this compound doesn't work, or why this compound works but not totally, and what have we learned in the past from the basic research that could make us understand why it was working or not. So it's a great moment, but we really have to work together, I think, to achieve something and to get a new treatment, efficacious treatment for celiac disease.
It's great. And Valerie, I love your comment of bridging. You are correct. Our basic scientists are, within our clinical trials, our clinicians, everyone, it's critical. We all work together and I think pool knowledge. And what's wonderful about the celiac world is it's small. And I feel like there are a lot of wonderful collegiate relationships through many institutions. And it's been fantastic to be a part of the past few years. And I know I'm optimistic. I think we're in a great place. And Dan, I would love you to kind of give a final round closeout about this topic before we move on.
Sure. So, I mean, everyone said, everything I agree with, and it's a great starting point. And I would say that one of the big advantages we have in celiac disease is that we have really, really good mouse models of the disease that Valerie has really led the way on. And I think these give us power to understand if medications are likely to work in a way that is really hard for a lot of other diseases. So I think we have a lot of advantages, and it's because of the basic science that has given us this strong foundation. So, I think that the thing, it's hard to make new therapies. Biology is hard. The regulatory environment is always shifting. It's not always clear what the FDA wants. It's not always clear what insurers are going to pay for. And I know we all struggle. I struggle this with my clinic every day. It's like, oh, what is insurance going to pay for today? And that makes it hard as well, because obviously you don't want to have a drug that people aren't going to have access to. So there's just a lot of challenges, but I do think we've come a long way. I think we learned a lot. And I think even every trial, while we've had some trials that haven't unfortunately allowed the drug to proceed. Every trial we've done in celiac disease, we've learned a great deal about the better way to do celiac disease trials, who to involve in the trials, what the outcomes should be, how to talk to regulators and the community about this. And I think the thing we just need more and more of is time, patience, and participation more than anything else. But I do think we're getting there.
I agree. I think, and I love reading these comments and the Q&A also for people who are looking for ways, as you kind of can understand, participation in trials wherever you live are so important. And whatever diseases you are dealing with, it really does help move science forward. And one thing, Doug, I wanted to ask you gave such a great overview. Someone asked, can you kind of timestamp? I know we can't timestamp science, but from the onset of a phase 1 until typically, the end. And maybe Doug wants to take this too. What is the timeline of that, like in time versus just explaining the trials?
So I wish there was a standard, but I'll try and give you some overview. And Dan, feel free to weigh in here as well based on your experience. But typically, a phase 1s may take a year to 2 years to complete by the time you get everything done and you're ready to move into the next phase. So let's just take phase 1. The trial itself may be fairly short if you can recruit healthy volunteers fast enough, and it could be 6 months to a year, but by the time you get the next trial set up, it's another 6 to 9 months. So typically, that's about anywhere from a year to 2 years. And then the phase 2 programs, each one runs, depending on how long the trial is. As I mentioned, the 2A study may be a shorter endpoint, so it might be a 6 to 12-week trial. You're looking at probably 18 months to 2 years to get that done. The phase 2B is probably another 2 to 3 years. And then the phase 3 program can run anywhere from 2 to 4 years. So all told, if you add it all up, I'd say from start to finish, 8 to 9 years from the beginning of the phase 1s to the time that you finish the phase 3s is probably not unreasonable. There may be some companies that do a little faster, some companies that do a little slower, but in general, about 8-ish to 9-ish years from start to finish. If that helps, I hate to overgeneralize, but I find that sometimes I don't want to mislead as well. So I think that's probably a standard to look at.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it is a slow process, which can be, on one level, it sounds sort of arduous and frustrating, and sometimes it does feel that way. But the other way to look at it is that it's a very careful and deliberate approach, where we only move to the next stage when we're really sure we have something that looks promising and safe in the stage before. So I think on one level, yes, we'd all like to have things develop faster. On the other hand, I think there's some comfort in the way that the system works.
And I think, from a patient standpoint, obviously that's reassuring to know that there are lots of checks in place. So we're not just rushing through a drug because that's what people want. So I think that's a reassuring point. However, yes, 10 years sounds like a lifetime. So sometimes that is daunting. So I am going to go from a patient standpoint. So from a patient standpoint, we've heard about this drug and that drug, and we've heard about the vaccine, and it's almost here, and then, oops, it's not here. What happened? Like, what can be, not that there are significant details, I mean, whatever one can share, because that is one of the frustrations we were told as patients, and we told as clinicians to the patients that there will be something around the corner, and the around the corner never happened. So what happened? Is that things were rushing, or is it again something else? So maybe, Dan, I'm going to put you on the hot seat for that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I've been saying, we'll have a drug within 5 years for celiac disease, and I've been saying that for about 15 years now. So I'm as guilty as anyone at being overly optimistic about where we would get and how quickly. I think it just is a very nuanced disease space. I think that complexity of the the disease activity, which varies greatly between people, and the sensitivity to gluten, which varies between people, and some of the limitations with our endpoints that Carol mentioned about, biopsy isn't perfect and symptoms aren't perfect. It's one of the things that actually makes it a great clinical practice, because there is so much complexity on the social and biological basis. But it's one of the things that I think made it more challenging than we initially thought. And we had to learn, really through trial and error, ways to design trials to mitigate some of these and select the right population. So I really think it was all good intention, and we went in with trials that were very thoughtful at the time, but it needed to see how those read out to be able to understand the best way to hold these trials. And I really think that was the biggest thing. It was just, we couldn't do trials just like, that looked like an IBD trial or looked like an IBS trial. These have to be very specific trials for a very specific disease. And it took some time to figure that out.
And I think that's an important part for all of us as clinicians and us as patients to understand that it's not as simple as just go in and try a drug and so on. Even from the symptoms, we have some patients that have no symptoms and yet their biopsies are terrible. And then there are those that have a lot of symptoms. So everyone is so variable that it becomes difficult to find a drug. As you mentioned, Dan, you're always thinking about having multiple approaches to the patients, which I think we don't hear about as much with IBD because there are so many drugs. So in clinical practice, we are always switching medicines around based on how someone is doing. So I guess till the first drug comes out, we'll be still questioning this whole thing. But if I can ask Valerie, why can't you use that mouse model to try out different drugs?
Why can we or can we not?
Can we not? So because, to me, if I'm sitting here, I'm saying, all right, I got this drug, Dan's got this drug, Doug has got this drug, you've got a mouse model, why not?
It's not that easy either.
Okay.
And, although, I've been at first and foremost a mouse immunologist, I recognize very, very well the limitation of a mouse model. It's a model. And the model is not the perfect, imitation, let's say, of the human disease. So first of all, the mouse model we have developed is a humanized mouse model at DQ8. So one would be only able to try drugs, that are going to target DQ8 and not DQ2. If you're trying, to target DQ2, you won't be able to use this mouse model. Then the physiology of a mouse is very different from the physiology of a human. And we know, for instance, that in our mouse model, we have tissue damage in a different location of the gut. And that may be due, that there's a faster transit time in the mice. The nutrient absorption happen in a different location in the gut. So we couldn't really try also in this mouse model we couldn't analyze the efficacy of, for example, maybe digestive enzyme that are aimed at processing the gluten. So there's some limitation. This mouse model can be used for, maybe for to try to induce immune tolerance. Yes, that can be used. So there's some therapy that can be used in the mouse model and that cannot. So I think that as a basic scientist, we have to be super thoughtful about which model we can use to test which therapy. And same as it's not that easy either, but we can. And I think there's this mouse model, there's going to be other, that's going to be better. And I think we're getting there, having more robust animal models that are going to help us actually go through this phase 1 and test the novel therapies.
So that, is again, something that we can look forward to in the future, but brings back to where we need patient participation in clinical trials. And obviously it's not for every person. It is definitely not for every person and has to be a thoughtful discussion and pros and cons and so on. So and that of course is a limitation for many of these studies, right? Would you say, Valerie?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I can add, the same as with my perspective of basic scientists, we're working on mice, but we're working also more and more using samples from patients actually, because what we're observing in mice, we need to corroborate with samples from patients and vice versa. You know, something that we see in patient, we're trying to understand what it means functionally in a mouse model. So it's also very important for us to have the participation of patients who come for a visit with you, a gastroenterologist, and have an endoscopy and have a blood draw. It's extremely important for us to be able also to use some of the samples to really, you know, better understand the immune landscape of this patient and go back and forth like that, animal model, human, to get better understanding of the disease.
And I think for all of the drug development, for other therapies in celiac disease, we are all extremely thankful to the patients, because again, it is at a cost that for everyone to join in, but thoughtful discussions obviously need to happen. And that is one of the limitations sometimes in clinical trials, is having patient participation and feeling comfortable with whatever you sign on for. But knowing that whatever data is being used is going to be used very thoughtfully. And so just like the data will be used thoughtfully, the signature on that line for consent needs to be done thoughtfully as well with that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Verma, I would love to switch topics a little bit and look to our panelists to discuss what are the most promising therapeutics right now in celiac disease, whatever phase they're in, and could you speak to what their aims are of these therapeutics? So I don't know if Doug or Dan or Carol want to take a stab at this, but just taking a look at what is currently being studies out there in therapeutics specifically for celiac disease. Or should I call in one of you?
I don't think anyone wants that one, honestly. That's a fraught question. So I'm not going to pick favorites. I really, you know, I think there are, you know, as I said, there's a number of drugs out there targeting different things. There are glutenases that break down gluten. There are antibodies that block key inflammatory chemicals related to celiac disease. There's drugs that block enzymes that convert gluten to more toxic forms. There's a number of different things that target the immune system. There's even some things that target the microbiome, the bugs living in your intestine, that can help convert gluten to more or less toxic forms. And I think all of them have great potential. I think that's why they're in trials. So I think we just have to let the data play out, and I'm very hopeful that there'll be, you know, just like we see in inflammatory bowel disease, there'll be 3 or 4 of these things available, and that, you know, clinicians and patients will have the ability, like there is in so many other diseases, to pick the thing that's right for them. So I kind of evaded your question, but
It's
I hope
okay.
that's helpful.
But
No.
let me ask you a question anyway, Dan. If I have patients who are teenagers, right? So their question is, when is it, or is there a time that's going to be where I can go out, still eat gluten-free food? This is actually from one of my children as well, and you've heard me ask this question before. I will continue to eat a gluten-free diet. I do not have a problem with that, but I would like something that I can take so I don't have to ask those specific questions for cross-contamination. Is there something like that that's in line? Is there some light at the end of the tunnel? And I totally get it that none of us, because we promised and overpromised with the vaccine, so we're not going there. But is that something possibly out there? And I know my teenager patients ask all this time, and I know their parents would like that, so then they have peace of mind that the child is on a gluten-free diet, but not asking those questions.
So, I mean, we'll see, but my belief would be that anything that is efficacious, safe and efficacious enough to get approved, should be very, very appropriate for that use and should cover those type of accidental intermittent gluten exposures. I don't think that's too much to ask. I think that's actually a very reasonable ask from our patients, but and should be something very achievable with multiple of the therapeutics that are out there that are being studied today. Personally, I'd be curious though, Doug or others, what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think again, going back to the group of patients I described, the non-responsive celiac disease patients, that's the target, and so those are the patients that have symptoms, continue to have probably, they're on a gluten-free diet. Again, I agree with what Dr. Semrad said, which is that the gluten-free diet is going to be there. It's an important part of whatever therapy that's in development right now. It's always going to be an important part of that, and so I think. When we think about what the therapies are going to do, that's what most of the therapies that are out there right now are, and the ones that are furthest along are targeting that population of to avoid or to help with inadvertent exposure to gluten, just the patients that you described, Ritu.
Yeah, I think I'll just add, to me, there are a lot of companies very interested in trying to promote tolerance to gluten, pure tolerance where you can eat it again. And I think that first vaccine was, to even pretend that was going to work was a little bit, would be so optimistic that, but every now and then the first shot out, you get something that actually works and it's the answer. But I think a lot of companies are working on that. And the reason is because if they can figure out how to promote tolerance to gluten, there's a lot of other autoimmune diseases where you could start promoting tolerance to whatever the body's attacking. You could kind of use the same, perhaps, mechanism. So I think a lot of companies out there are working on it. I don't think that the failed vaccine is the end of that at all. In fact, I think that was just the beginning of the real true cure, which is to allow people to eat gluten again because you don't recognize it as foreign anymore. So I still think that that's in its own place. The rest of it is a lot of it gluten-free plus to help people who either are more sensitive to it or can't adhere to it, or we don't even talk about the cost of it and all of what goes into a gluten-free diet. So it can be extremely burdensome for a lot of patients. But I think it's a great disease model to do this for, and I still think someone's going to get that. I don't know who is going to get it, but someone's going to get it right. And I think celiac will be the first disease where they get it right to really promote the actual damping down of an immune response so it doesn't recognize and attack anymore. But that's just my thought about it. But I am one of those people who never was optimistic. So I never said soon. I used to say, in your lifetime, if someone's a young celiac person, I say in your lifetime.
So Carol, I want to come back to you because I know you see patients all the time.
Yes,
and Dr. Verma really touched upon what her teenagers are asking. But what do your patients say that they would like to see in a drug?
Well, I think the main thing is the issue of socializing. It's socialization. It's going out to dinners, to friends' houses, traveling on planes, and just feeling like they don't have to scrutinize every single time they go out. And I think it's exhausting. And I think that is a huge burden. I don't know that the actual gluten-free diet, I mean, there's a lot to it, but most people can accept it eventually from what I see in patients. And I'm not saying, oh, just accept it. You're lucky there's something to treat it with. But in fact, you are really lucky, and you're really lucky that the bowel can come back to normal unlike other chronic inflammatory diseases. So, I mean, in a way, it's a great thing, but it's also just a very difficult way to live. And especially nowadays, maybe before, when people were at home and cooking more at home and it was just that kind, but people are on the go, they're moving, they're flying, they're going everywhere. So I think that's what in my view, that's what adults really want. But clearly everyone would like to eat gluten again. Maybe not everyone, but if they could, I think it's hard to argue that someone would say to me, I don't care, I would still rather be on a gluten-free diet if I could eat it and it didn't harm me.
Yeah.
So I still think that that's where, to me, the biggest advance will be. If we get to there, that will be major. But the small steps are equally important because they're helpful to patients of various different kinds.
Absolutely.
So,
Doug,
but that's it. That's what adults
you.
want.
Well, thanks, Carol. Doug, I want to shift to you. You mentioned, when you were talking, that some people might not want to participate in a clinical trial because they have adverse reactions to gluten challenges. And so how can someone, we've seen quite a few comments actually in the chat and also pre-questions. They want to support clinical research, but they don't feel comfortable themselves doing a gluten challenge. Can you talk about ways they can support different studies?
Sure. I mean, there's multiple opportunities to participate in research, and going back to what Valerie said, you don't have to participate in a drug therapy trial. There are other ways to participate. There are, as Valerie alluded to sign off to agree to have, if you're undergoing, standard of care biopsies for your general visits to your gastroenterologist, things like that, blood samples that they may take as an extra tube of blood when you're undergoing a visit to the office. There are many different ways. The patient support groups, another great opportunities to participate in I'll call it clinical research, but again, not not drug research, but about symptoms and general well-being and how you deal with the disease on a regular basis. So there's a wide variety of ways to do that without ever being exposed to gluten and or a potential drug or placebo. Now, with that said, I want to make sure that, as I mentioned, the phase 2A studies may involve a gluten challenge, but beyond that, there are multiple opportunities again where there won't be a gluten challenge associated with the trial, which is also an opportunity again to move into the pharmacotherapy world, that you may be able to participate in a trial and still not be exposed to doses of gluten. So again, I would encourage anyone who's interested in participating in research to find a way that they're comfortable with. And like I said, the group at the University of Chicago can help find many opportunities, whether it's again clinical pharmacotherapy research or other types of research. There's many different ways to participate.
Wait, could I just hop in here for 1 minute? Can anyone address, is there any thought in the future about in vitro challenges where the tissue is taken out of the body and challenged in a dish or in a blood test instead of, having to go through a patient taking it, swallowing it, and getting sick with it? Is there anything on this, Dan? Or
so, I mean, there actually
Valerie?
is. I mean, obviously, so I guess the gluten exposure thing is a big topic, and I think it's a very, very important one, because while it can, for good reason, be a little scary to say, in certain trials you have to eat gluten. We also know that we're never going to know if a drug can protect people against gluten if we don't test it with people eating gluten, right? So it's sort of a catch-22. I would also say though that there's different levels of gluten. And one of the things that we've gotten better at is actually reducing the amount of gluten in clinical trials. And so clinical trials these days, in general, use a lot less gluten and make people a lot less sick than they did 5 or 10 years ago. And we actually have much more comforting data around how quickly people resolve, and that there really aren't long-term consequences of a closely monitored trial that lasts a couple weeks to a couple months with gluten, with some gluten exposure. So I think I want to put that aside. That being said, there is some really interesting work that's being done. Some of it's being done by an immunologist, Bob Anderson, looking at sort of an in vitro blood test where you can see if somebody's still reacting to gluten and if a therapy might have made them less reactive to gluten. I don't think that's ever going to be at the place where you can get a drug approved based on those, because you really need to show that it helps people feel better. But I think these can be perhaps very important tools to understand who, how to select people for a trial, and to understand, over a longer term, how a drug, depending on the drug, might be affecting people's immune reaction to gluten. So I think there is some exciting work in that area. Again, that work actually came out of a clinical trial that didn't succeed for the drug, but now we have actually tools around cytokines that are close to clinic. So it actually shows one of the ways that participating in a clinical trial can really benefit the field and patients, even if that drug doesn't turn out to be something that can go forward.
That's great. I don't know if anyone else, Valerie, if you wanted to touch upon that just from the work that you're doing.
No, I think Dan said exactly what needed to be said, especially with the benefit of of understanding whether the clinical trial works or not and why, and that the next facts, what the best example, actually something amazing came out of it. Although everybody at first was really disappointed, and that it didn't reach the primary endpoint, but it turned out to be it's turning out to be a success story, because if we can have a whole world assay to measure, whether you're exposed to gluten, you're reactive to gluten with IL-2 release, that's going to be amazing. So, yeah.
So volunteering for any of, whether it's a drug development or clinical research or something, somewhere along the way will help somebody. May not help us directly, but somewhere along the way, even, as you're on a gluten-free diet, the biopsies that were done, we've gone through a long way where we used to do 3 biopsies to make a diagnosis of celiac disease to where we are doing 1 or maybe none. So I think all that comes from experience and learning and patients volunteering for these things, which is a lot to ask people, but again, it forwards science, and it helps somebody. It helps our generations coming after us as well in terms of the knowledge base. So yeah, it's sacrifices all around, but worth it in the end.
And Dr. Verma, I'm going to turn this question to you really quickly to start this discussion, but where can people, a lot of people are asking, where can they find out about trials? Or even, I loved, Doug, you gave the example of the blood samples and tissue samples when you're getting your routine. Someone just asked that in the chat. When you're getting your routine visits and you might have an endoscopy, a follow-up endoscopy and blood work, and you want to help in that way, how do you go about finding out this information? How can we help
at
people?
A center, if you're at is that the question? Like if you're
or
to visit with
maybe
Carol,
they don't.
if you're
Yes.
coming to visit with Carol, then you have all the research assistants who give you all that information. If you're not seeing, I mean, obviously I don't have anything in pediatrics as far as clinical trials, and I keep telling Dan and Doug, we need to do something for our teenagers and our adolescents because they're asking, and I think it's something that we all need to think about and not keep pediatrics behind. But I think patients who come to see Carol get all the information from their research assistants. And if you're looking at from a center standpoint in Chicago, and if they are not in a visit, they can always reach out on the website.
Fantastic.
And then there's the clinical, there's a whole trials website that people can look at for trials across the country. If you have your local advocacy groups, those have things as well. So I'm not sure if they're asking for a specific site, but
I think people are just looking. That was a great example, I think, for it piqued people's interest. And I know Valerie was smiling when Doug said that, because it's part of something I know we do here at University of Chicago and in pediatrics and adult. It's a really wonderful way that benefits, obviously, Valerie, as she said, testing the mouse model. Doug or Dan, could you talk to me about age limits? Dr. Verma's touching upon pediatrics, but I also want to talk about the other spectrum of age. Is there a threshold of age where you are really looking for viable candidates when you're recruiting for studies?
So I guess I'll start. I mean, so the answer is, in general, we will put age ranges on the studies that we do, but they're pretty broad. I mean, typically going to be for trials that don't involve pediatric patients. I'm a pediatric gastroenterologist, so everything that Ritu said resonates with me. I'd love to start with pediatrics. Unfortunately, the general model is to test in adults first to make sure it's safe and then move into kids. But so generally speaking, 18 to 75 to 80 years old is the range that you'll see most of the time with clinical studies. During the COVID era, and I can speak from experience in the trial we had, we dropped the age down to 70 from 75, mainly because we were worried about comorbidities, not having anything to do with the drug that we were investigating, but just to make sure that people, that there weren't issues with comorbid events or illnesses outside of the trial. But generally, those are the age ranges that you'll see when you do a study. Some studies, in some cases, they will enroll adolescent patients in the adult cohort. So they may go down to 15, 16-year-old and then 16 and up to, as I mentioned, 75 or 80. Particularly when you get into the phase 3 studies that I mentioned, that's becoming more of an accepted practice to enroll older adolescents in adult studies. But that's the general range.
That's great. Thank you. Dan, do you have anything to add to that?
Nope, that was great.
So what I want to do is kind of look to our panelists one last time, and we have done a lot of digging, and I think in some ways talked about what isn't working or what has. I would love to end on an optimistic note of what everyone is looking forward to in research in celiac drug development, and kind of leave people with, where are we going? What do we have to look forward to? So, Dan, why don't you kick us off with that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think I'm looking forward to what probably most people listening. I'm looking forward to a day when in clinic I can give people different options and say, how are you doing on the diet? Do you need anything more? And if that answer is yes, talk through different options and say, all right, this is probably a good fit for you, just like we do with somebody with, I don't know, type 2 diabetes or something. So I'm just looking forward to getting something finally to all the patients who have been asking all these years.
Absolutely. And Doug, do you have anything?
I would agree. I mean, I think the first step is let's get, this is not to say I don't want multiple, but I think having the first one approved and then, I think, seeing a drug taken across the finish line would be great for the community. And then, I totally agree with Dan that being able to go into a clinic and have multiple options to offer a patient would be an incredible feat within the celiac space.
Dr. Verma, do you have something to add?
I think really looking at something that improves the quality of life of a family, a child, a parent. And for some, the gluten-free diet is all that they want. They don't want to go outside that, and that's totally fine. I think we have models with eosinophilic esophagitis where we have a diet, we have several different medications. And that, again, is a really good example of where at one time it was always the diet. That's all we had was diet there for that particular condition. And then we ended up with 4 different options. And it's giving the options and getting the quality of life for that family and that child to be optimal is what I would like. And I think just seeing what's happened over the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years, I do believe that there will be options. And I'm going to take Carol's line, and in this patient's lifetime, there will be options there. But it's just having that option. I think when people feel there's nothing else, then you feel like there's no hope. But there is hope. And just like we have other conditions, we'll get there in celiac too.
Yeah, absolutely. Valerie?
Yeah, what I'm looking forward to, I hope that what we're doing is going to be useful and that we can do more and more translational research. And what we've been doing in the lab is going to be used by the company to develop those drugs. So that's what I'm looking forward to. And I think we're getting there.
And Carol, do you want to go ahead?
Well, of course, I'm thinking oral tolerance. I'm going for the cure. So that's what I'm looking for. I think short of that, it's, the expense You still have to be on a gluten-free diet. I mean, I think those small things will be additive, but I think the biggest thing would be allowing, or somehow getting rid of those cells that recognize gluten in the gut.
Yeah.
That would be, to me, kind of the ultimate, but understanding that there'll be steps along the way. It may come fast, it may come slow, and we clearly need different arms to, as everyone said, to treat people accordingly, what works for them the best we can. But in the end, I want the oral tolerance.
I think
Promoting oral tolerance.
I love it. That's a great goal. And I hope, for the people joining us tonight, the goal was really to educate. I think we hear about trials and, what's happening out there, or a failed trial. And I was hoping through this program, and I hope all of you got through this, is that you're understanding the phases of these trials, ways you can participate. And what I promise we will do in our follow-up to those who are with us tonight is Lindsay will send some resources of where trials, I know not all of you are based here in Chicago. And so just where there are a lot of clinical trials listed, we will absolutely send that along. And obviously things here at University of Chicago. But I hope that with patient support, patient advocacy, and having your follow-up visits and, reading and educating ourselves, we will keep moving this discussion forward. Dr. Verma, do you have any closing thoughts for tonight?
No, I just hope that everyone knows that people are working very hard. The gluten-free diet is here to stay, and it'll always stay, and it's fantastic. But there will be more options coming in the future.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank everyone. We have a lot of other questions, and there's never enough time. But I want to thank you for being a part of tonight. And I hope you walked away with more knowledge. We have work to do, but there is definite progress. We have made a lot of progress. So thank you to our panelists for joining us. I want to thank Doug and Dan and Carol and Valerie, Lindsay and Dr. Verma. This was a really fantastic discussion. So thank you very, very, very much.